This time 30 years ago, I'd just finished my final year of a law degree, sat the exams, and I just started dating this incredibly attractive, gorgeous woman who, for some fortunate reason, is still my wife today. Her father at the time was the ambassador to Burma, and so she took me to Burma, and we spent time going to the Shwedagon in Rangoon. We then also went up to Bagan, and spent time travelling the temples there. And then when I came back to Rangoon, I had the fortune to meet this quite extraordinary individual. His name is Min Tain, who's known as Uncle Monty. Like me, he'd studied law and gone to England, and he was the first Chief Justice in Burma. And he did all the negotiations at the UN. And I went and spent some time sitting with him in his lounge, and he was sipping his gin and tonics, as was his wont. And all around the lounge was what he called his rogues gallery, and there were photos of him and Mao, and him and Chiang Kai-shek, and him and Ho Chi Minh. And I thought this was pretty impressive. And I was talking to him about his life, and he also shared the fact that there were two periods when he'd been imprisoned by the military. And on the second occasion, his wife started dying, and they wouldn't let him out to go and see her. And I was very much sort of taken by all these famous people, and I asked him what it was that he sort of helped to get him through, and he said, well, I have this sort of daily meditation practice. And anyway, I heard that, but it didn't quite register. So I then went back and joined the Australian equivalent State Department. I ended up working in a number of places around the world, and then became very politically ambitious. But along the path, I lost a 20-year-old cousin to suicide, and in pretty horrific circumstances, but I put that behind and wanted to pursue the world of politics. I had chronic fatigue from a number of other traumas and things that had happened, but in 1994 I ended up finding myself working for Prime Minister Keating. I felt that I was sort of misinvited, but there I was. We did a whole lot of work around the internet and multimedia, but when I was there, I was really struggling to keep it together. I got to the end of the year and I decided I wanted to go off and do a meditation course with this bifurcated notion that somehow it was going to be really difficult, so that would be really good for me, but also I just needed a rest. I was just absolutely exhausted. So I went off to do a 10-day Vipassana course, as many of you here will have done, and I think it's day 3 or day 4 where you have this time where you stop for about 3 periods of about 1 hour where you don't move a finger. Somehow I got the instructions wrong. Instead of about 3 hours, I ended up doing about 5.5. And for those 5.5, I felt like I had a knitting needle stuck in my knee. And the sort of self-flagellating Catholic of me thought this must be doing me a hell of a lot of good. Until I woke up the next morning and my whole knee had sort of blown up. And there was a realization, look after your knee, look after your body, stop work. And so I went back and went into the Prime Minister's office and said, look, I'm out of here, and spent a lot of time with my young daughter. And you know, there's that Dostoevsky thing about spending time with children that we're healed, beginning of a process. But I was probably clinically depressed, and in '95, they set up the Microsoft network. I found myself in an online conversation with about 30 people around the world who were talking to Deepak Chopra, who at the time was based here in San Francisco. I asked him some questions around using technology for social good, and he said, well, of course you should do that. And so off the back of that, we had this idea of using the internet to try and address youth suicide in Australia, and that was sort of born of my own experience. And so that was when we set up the Inspire Foundation, who, as Andy said, we then set up in Ireland and also the United States. At the same time that I got involved in setting up Inspire, I'd sort of come to the realization I'd become very addicted to my Vipassana meditation. I felt that my spiritual destiny was to be a monk in a cave, and I was an absolute pain in the arse to be around the house. My wife was saying, please go away, Jack. It could not possibly be worse to not have you than to have you here being resentful of your family. It was at that time that I actually met my teacher, Khenpo Nawang Damche, who in a gently but firm way said to me, Jack, maybe your family is your spiritual destiny. I started doing practices with him, and I found there was a profound sense of coming home, and he remains my teacher today. What happened was that when I set up the Inspire Foundation, we had a couple of enlightened directors, one of whom many of you here will know, Alexandra Ewell, who's been doing a lot of work around spiritual care. And what had happened was, on the basis of my experience with percussion, I had these sort of mixed motivations. I wanted to be able to do more of that on a regular basis, but I also did want other people to try and taste the fruits of what I had experienced. And so I went to the directors and I said, I'd like for us to institute where we actually give people a week of paid leave every year to go and embark upon some reflection. And the idea was thinking that what worked for me would be appropriate for other people. So we sort of instituted it, and we only got very small take-up by a couple of people. And then what I started to realise is that each and every one of us knows what it is we're not yet paying attention to. And so what happened was we sort of dropped this prescriptive notion about what it was that you needed to do on reflection. It didn't have to be a Buddhist retreat or a yoga retreat, or you didn't have to be in mindfulness. What we found was that people knew what it was that they most needed to do. And so we set up the reflection leave, and let me just touch briefly on the guidelines. So the first thing is that after 6 months, all full-time employees are entitled to 5 days paid reflection leave each year, prorated for part-time employees. And the idea about paying for it is that you can not have any justification saying, I don't have enough vacation leave, or it's going to take me away from spending time with family. This is something over and above, and if you don't use it in a given year, you lose it. We ask that people do it in a single block of 5 continuous days. It can be taken alone or with a group, but one of the things that's really important is to stress that it's not a vacation. If you're feeling tired, exhausted, burned out, go and have a rest, go and have a break. This is all about being consciously reflective. And also too, we don't always achieve it, but we ask that people be digitally free. When we started doing this back in the mid to late 90s or whatever, that wasn't such a big challenge. It's certainly a big challenge today. In terms of the process, we have an initial discussion to talk around someone's particular program, then ask them to provide a written outline and schedule what they want to do so that there's a sense of rigour or repetition in terms of that week. Then in terms of when they take it, that's entirely up to their manager. When they come back, they're encouraged to share the experience with the team. There's always flexibility to work out what's appropriate for a given individual. And the sorts of leave, and these are just examples, as I mentioned, meditation, yoga retreat, sometimes a wilderness walk, mapping a family history, a program of nourishing activities, or in some cases, the Artist's Way program. So the thing for me is it's not about being prescriptive about saying what anyone should do. You do sometimes need to spend time to sit with people to get them in the position so that when they're away, they're constantly reflecting about where it is that they are. A couple of years ago, I came here to San Francisco, and that was to run the Inspire USA Foundation. A week or two after I came here, I was having some photos taken for a documentary that was being done in Australia, and it was just down here at Chrissy Fields. And halfway through the photography session, I looked towards the bridge, and I said to the guy who was doing the lights, I said, "Oh, it looks like there's a fire under the bridge." And he said, "Oh, no, that's not a fire, it's a jumper." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, what's happened is someone's just jumped off the bridge, and what they do is they drop a flare so that the people across can come and pick up the body." And that was sort of the start of my time in the United States. And the other thing too, which I still struggle with, and maybe someone can help me seriously with this at the end. When I came here, you looked at the statistics. I don't know if any of you got kids at high school here, but the CDC does a survey every 2 years of the youth risk behaviours. The numbers that were released in June of this year, which was last year, and I'm sort of jumping ahead to the end of my speech, but there's, in the last 12 months, 8% of US high school students attempted suicide. Right? That's about 1.3 million. And when I came here, I sort of thought that I was going to do something about that. And I found that I got to the position where I couldn't, but in a sense, trying to sort of, if you like, be there at the edge of the cliff, you suddenly look over and you realise that you're a little bit closer to the cliff yourself than would be nice. I went and up to Padmasambhava Institute when my root guru, His Holiness Sakya Trizin, was giving teachings. And it was at the beginning of a bizarre experience because I'd just come from a board meeting where I'd found out that the directors of the foundation were meeting in secret and trying to wind up the organisation. And it was as though samsara was there in its most bizarre and weird. I went up to receive the teachings. I saw His Holiness. I asked for his advice, and he said, oh, maybe you should go back to Australia. I'd been to see him 2 months before in New York, and I said, Your Holiness, should I stay in the States or should I go back to Australia? Just tell me what to do. Tell me what's going to help the world the best. And at that point in time, he said, oh, it makes no difference. I thought, okay, it wasn't the answer I was looking for. I drove back from up at Padmasambhava Institute. I was coming back here into San Francisco. I got to Novato and suddenly all the traffic had banked up. This is about, an hour out of San Francisco. I looked over on the side of the road and there were tow trucks. I should call them tow trucks here, but there was a car that was all mangled. I drove home. I got on the internet the next morning. I typed in car accident Novato. And as I had suspected, a young guy had actually driven his car into the tree. And at that point in time, I didn't feel responsible. I didn't feel I need to do anything more, or I didn't feel like I needed to stay. But in a sense, that part of the journey was over. I then went back to Australia. I worked very briefly with the Secretary of State. I saw in him a big part of myself, which was basically a good person who was trying to do big works in the world, but in a sense doing them because sometimes those things are easier than to deal with things closer to home. And some of you will know of Doug Hammarskjöld's, the UN Secretary General, in markings his diary, where he talks about sometimes we create these grand noble projects because they're easier to deal with than dealing with things closer to home. And so in a sense, I think my intentions to try and set up a global youth suicide prevention organisation had a little bit of that, but we have helped lots of people. I worked for the Foreign Minister. It was completely unsustainable, but what I saw in him was that it's not enough to have good intentions. One needs to have insight. And when Paul Ekman was going through those the lists, one of the big challenges of our time, I think, is around the mania. And people will talk about our depression because it's easier to have insight into depression. We have a sense of having been sort of bad then and good now, or good then and bad now. The thing around the mania, the thing around the excitement and all that is it's really hard to get insight. And so for me, partly having a daily meditation practice is trying to ground me there. The Foreign Minister resigned. I got approached to go and run an organisation, and you'll like this name, called Sane Australia. I didn't want to do it. It was in another city. I thought I should go and just take the interview anyway. I went down, I took the interview, and I've got 2 minutes, and I'm going to really rush this. And so what happened was that I didn't want the job, and someone said to me, look, can you please meet one of the other directors? And so I met this guy, and he was a businessman. He was from the other side of Australia. He was a very devout Catholic. He was a very conservative voter. And I met with him, and I didn't want the job. And he was speaking to me, and he'd lost a son to suicide who'd had schizophrenia, and he knew of the work that we've been involved in doing. But anyway, I kept pushing back, and I said, look, if I was to come here at Sane, everyone at Sane would have to get reflection leave the same we got at Inspire. And I was trying to, and he said, oh, tell me about that. And I explained to him, and I sort of said, you know, there was a young woman on our front desk who was a foster child, and for her reflection leave, what she did was to go back and meet her birth mother, who she hadn't seen in 20 years or something. Anyway, he starts saying how he's involved in the Christian Meditation Society for the past 25 years. He then proceeds to tell me that there are a group of, I think, Brigidine nuns in the city where he was that had a link to an ashram in India. And he said he used to go and meditate in this ashram for about 7 or 8 years until his wife told him to stop doing it. And my excited mind leapt and said, I've got to get you a book by the Dalai Lama. It's called The Good Heart. It's where he sits down with the Christian He said, no. He said, I've got the book. He said, I've read it. He said, when the Dalai Lama came to Perth in January, I sat next to him at breakfast. And so I said, okay, I'll take the job. About 2 days later, I got rung up by the Secretary of State's Chief of Staff, that was the job I was hanging out for, and he said to me, look, I'm sorry about the delay. This is a call that came in from Washington. The Secretary of State's going to be back in Australia next Tuesday. Can you start work next week? And I said, no, I've got another job. And he said, can I talk you out of it? And I said, no. And when I started at Sane, there's a woman there, amazing woman with schizophrenia, and she's written a book. And I said, can you please inscribe this book for me? And she wrote, Dear Jack, may you stay sane at Sane. And then I realised that that is the biggest challenge that we face, is to stay sane. Can I just finish with one story or example of reflection leave? This is a woman, Kelly Betts. She worked with me at Inspire Foundation. Before she joined Inspire, she worked at Oxfam, Amnesty. Incredible woman, and ran projects around getting young people to sort of act out their passion. She got diagnosed with bowel cancer. I went and saw her about 18 months later, probably about 6 years ago, last month. And what happened was that she sat up on her bed, this is about 3 days before she died, and looking almost like a gaunt Buddha or whatever, legs crossed, she sort of pointed me and she said, Jack, this reflection leave thing, I want you to take this to organisations, social organisations. I can't remember if she said around Australia or around the world. So partly my being here today is following Kelly's instructions. In terms of reflection leave, we are in the process of having a website set up probably in a week or so, and the idea is just there's a place there for people to go and find out more about the leave, how it's done, and we've probably got only half a dozen organisations doing it, but we think it's a simple idea. Perhaps people employ it on a trial basis, but what I've found time and time again is every time a person goes and does it, it's a profound shift for them. And do not prescribe what they need to do. They know exactly what it is. So let me stop there. And sorry, the final reflection was just going to be, was around that number, but I do need help in trying to get that number out of my head because it's something that still disturbs me. But anyway, thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.